Hey guys, this lesson is on lipids, another type of organic molecule. These are very large molecules, so they store a lot of energy. They're non-polar, which means they do not mix with water. So if you come across an example of something that you think does not mix with water, then it's a pretty good clue that it is a lipid. They have a very high ratio of carbons and hydrogens in their molecule. Very, very long chains, and because they are so long, that means they have a lot of bonds, which allows them to store a lot of energy. So these are your long-term energy storing molecules. We need lipids for protection and also for insulation. If you think about whales that live in really cold waters, they have to maintain a constant body temperature. And the only way they could do that is if they were insulated. And these lipids help insulate them to help them maintain a constant body temperature. Now, there are four major examples of lipids. You have your fats, phospholipids, which are found in cells, and we'll talk about those, steroids, and waxes. Okay? Now, the monomers, or the building blocks for lipids, can vary depending on the type of lipids you have. But in general, we say that they're made up of fatty acids and glycerol. Okay? So let's look at each of these examples separately. Okay, so looking at fats first. There are two major types of fats, saturated and unsaturated. Each of these are made up of three long chains of carbons attached to a glycerol, and so we call them triglycerides. Okay, now saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature, so butter, lard, that white stuff you see on like steak. Those are all examples of saturated fat. These are really unhealthy for you. Then you have your unsaturated fats. Unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. So vegetable oil, peanut oil, any type of oil typically is considered to be unsaturated, and they're healthier for you than the saturated fats. Now I'm going to show you a picture of a triglyceride. Okay, so here's your glycerol group, and then these are your fatty acids. There are three of them. Okay, and as you notice, they're made up of a whole bunch of carbons. Okay, so each chain has a whole bunch of carbons. Now, they're not stable right now because they're missing some bonds. Okay, if we fill those bonds, remember they each need 4. I'm going to fill them with hydrogens. And I would do that all the way down each of them, okay? Well, when I do that, that means they're full of hydrogens. They're packed in there with hydrogens. And when that happens, we say that it is a saturated fat. Saturated is saturated with hydrogens. And that makes it a very solid structure, and so that's why it is solid at room temperature. Okay? But if I take one of those hydrogens away and make the bond a double bond now, okay, if we do a double bond, we remove a hydrogen, and so now we're taking hydrogen out, so it's no longer saturated, it is now unsaturated, and that's what oils are. So now that we have this space in here, the oils can be more liquid at room temperature. Okay, so that would be an unsaturated fat. Okay, so two types of fats. Their building blocks are called triglycerides. Okay, 3 fatty acid chains attached to a glycerol. Saturated is solid at room temperature. They have single bonds, and they're full of hydrogens. Unsaturated have double bonds. They're liquid at room temperature. Okay, and they make it a lot more fluid. Okay, our next type of lipid are steroids. Steroids are naturally found in us, like cholesterol, for example. Now, they look a lot different from the one I just showed you. These have 4 carbon rings that are fused together. Okay, keep that separate from the carbohydrates we talked about. Now, these are fused, so that you would see them side by side fused together, not bonded like what we would see with the carbohydrates. Now, another example of a steroid are your sex hormones. So, for example, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Those are examples of steroids as well. Okay, so naturally found in our body, and they're considered to be lipids. Not all hormones are lipids, but these particular ones are. All right, our next group are phospholipids. Okay, phospholipids. Phospho means that it has a phosphate group. Okay, and then they have lipids attached to them. Remember, lipids are nonpolar, so they do not mix with water. Okay, so I'm going to draw you a picture of a phospholipid. Okay, this is a phospholipid. Pretty simple. It kind of looks like a jellyfish. The top part of it is the phosphate group, and it mixes okay with water. But this bottom part is a lipid, and it does not mix with water. Again, it's nonpolar. So we say that this one is hydrophilic, water-loving, and this is hydrophobic, water-fearing. Now, in a cell, the membrane is made up of these, and it's actually made up of 2 layers of these. And so it really looks like that. Okay, so if this is the outside of the cell, and this is the inside of the cell, this is the membrane, and it's made up of a whole bunch of these phospholipids, okay, facing each other this way. Now this is important because inside of the cell is water, and outside of the cell is water. Okay, so there's water inside the cell and outside of the cell. Okay, so it's cool because these phosphate heads attract the water to the membrane, but these lipids repel them away. Okay, and that's very helpful because it helps maintain the structure of the cell, and it helps control what can go in and out of the cell. So it's really important structure for helping to maintain homeostasis. Okay, the last structure, or the last type of lipid, is a wax. And wax, you guys know what waxes are. Candle wax, ear wax, even the stuff that covers an apple, the skin of an apple, is made up of a waxy material called a cuticle. And all of these things are important to help make them waterproof. Okay, so waxes are a type of lipid. If it's waterproof, that means it's hydrophobic, which means it's non-polar, whereas water is polar. Okay, so those are the 4 types of lipids. You have fats, which are saturated or unsaturated. You have steroids, phospholipids, and waxes. Okay, now one last thing to remember is that they are big molecules, which means they have a lot of bonds. And you guys can see here, this is CH2, but there's 10 of them, so they're really long chains, which means there are a lot of bonds. And again, with a lot of bonds, there's a lot of energy. So this particular molecule, for every 1 gram you eat, you get 9 kilocalories, or 9 big calories. So these lipids store a lot more energy than the carbohydrates do. Remember, carbs only store 4, okay, where lipids store 9 because they're such large molecules needed for energy storage. Okay, that's it for lipids. Hope it helped.